Right. Okay. Well, we'll get started. Um, good morning. Welcome. Thank you guys for coming. I hope there is some interest in this topic. Everybody in the back hear me okay? Yep. Thank you. I'm not going to drift as much as the secretary did, but I will stay more put. So my name is Dave Tacket. This is probably my 25th year of being involved in IT. I think I started, my first 10 were as a technician. I was a field technician. I started in the point of sale industry, moved to servers, laptops, desktops, eventually moved into high-end servers, was a Dell's certified systems engineer, working on their same-day calls, commercial satellites. So I was a technician. I was a windshield warrior for about 10 years. Then I had an opportunity to move to the public segment. I used to make fun of all the people that I'd go take service calls for. Like, man, you know, you go, something's broken, you fix it, you leave, and as you're driving away, you're like, man, I'm glad I don't have to deal with Barbara and her Outlook Express problem every day, right? So that was my opinion. Well, then I went behind a desk and had to start dealing with Barbara and her Outlook Express problem. But I landed in a really unique position that was sort of crafting itself or branding itself at the time. So I didn't go in immediately to like a help desk position or even a break-fix spot. I landed in an industry that branded itself. So for about 11 and a half years at the Secretary of State's office, I worked in elections technology. For the last 2.5, I've been the CIO there. So when I moved into the CIO position, I had a really good thought about what my job was going to be. But when I took over in 17, the election of 16 changed the landscape of my job tremendously. And hopefully you'll be able to see why. I cannot take credit. That's why I put the TM after this phrase. I think originally it was coined by a guy named Merle King, who ran the Kennesaw State Elections Lab that served really as the elections technology division of the state of Georgia for their Secretary of State's office. I think he was the first one that coined it, but in our industry we have used this a lot. Sometimes it's attributed to a guy who used to work in the state of Ohio and now works for DHS, for CISA. It's sometimes credited to a guy out in Orange County, California. But we all sort of understand the concept, and that's the reason that I trademark it, because I didn't come up with it, but we all use it, but somebody actually did, coin it first. And what I want you to understand, or what I hope you come away from this presentation with, is a sense of the landscape of elections technology, and that means the technology that's being used, but also the education that is happening and needs to happen when you talk about elections and technology together. So those are the things I kind of hope you come away with. So a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, it was actually Florida, but I like, it sort of tells you my age. I was 9 years old when the first Star Wars came out, right? So and I saw it downtown, Capitol Street. I was 9, and it was pretty huge in my life, But Star Wars was really simple at that time, right? Something we'd never seen before. So when I first thought about putting slides together for tech folks, I thought, I'll use something that is near and dear to me, and some people may understand. But a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away called Florida, some of you remember the Bush-Gore thing in 2000? Yes? Okay. Well, that episode created something called the Help America Vote Act, right? So it is a time of hanging chads, right? If any of you understand that. The two things that came out of the Help America Vote Act, which was the federal legislation that was the knee-jerk to the dispute or the incident that was the Bush-Gore controversy in 2000. The federal government created the Help America Vote Act. There were several elements, several impacts of it, but the two most important as it relates to this discussion are all states had to go to a centralized voter registration system, electronic, computerized, and there had to be at least one voting system in every precinct or every polling location that was accessible to folks with disabilities, right? So those were the two major mandates for the technology side. And this is, again, the law was created in 2002, and all states had to have those mandates in place unless they asked for a waiver starting with the 2004 presidential election. Because this really, Help America Vote Act really applies to federal elections, right? It has impact down the ballot, state and local, but the biggest impacts of that legislation were the creation of the Election Assistance Commission, that is a federal agency responsible for overseeing the mandates of the Help America Vote Act. They engaged NIST, which most of you probably recognize, to form a TDG or a TGDC, the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, because if there are going to be voting systems that have to be certified, or if they have to be somewhat uniform or have standards, NIST was the best place to do it. That TGDC advised the Election Assistance Commission by creating voluntary voting system guidelines. So automatically we start creating acronyms that, you know, start to confuse everyone. But that's sort of the technical side about they're setting standards for what voting systems that are mandated have to have, and they're also making recommendations about those centralized voter registration systems. So there was a round of federal funds that went out to states to create plans. The states themselves created the plans on how they were going to implement all the mandates of the Help America Vote Act. But, you know, the two key pieces, again, you know, as for this discussion, the two key pieces are those direct recording electronic. There are multiple voting systems, but most of them have some sort of, you know, some sort of reading, tabulation. You know, DREs are actually the touch screens that some of you may use in your voting location, or you fill out a ballot, it's optically read, and then it's tabulated. But the other thing that they had to figure out was, are we going to be a top-down or a bottom-up voter registration system? Now, some of the examples that I will give, or what I speak from, is how West Virginia is laid out. But top-down or bottom-up simply means that either the state from top-down hosts that VR system and gives the local jurisdictions access to it, or there are local systems that are standalone, but that data is then aggregated at the state level. So that's basically the rough definition when it applies to the voter registration system, top-down versus bottom-up. So with those things happening, data becomes available at the state level. So everyone that wants to ingest that data or use it as metrics, now it becomes big data. It is the beginning of interconnected systems. So if you think about that top-down or bottom-up system, how do you access it? How do you permission it? How do you control it? Things like that. They are connecting voter registration, absentee ballot data, provisional ballot data, and candidate data, because a lot of those voter registration systems at the beginning had some sort of candidate management component to it as well. So for the first time, big data is available at the state level. And once you make data available, people want it, and they want it more often, and they want it bigger and better. So that joins the election administration and the information technology environments really for the first time. They've always been joined to some degree, but with these mandates, you put electronic voting machines and you create this centralized voter registration database. Those are two really big impacts that join elections and technology. So Merle basically created this, and this is kind of what we use, and you can tell this is the best resolution copy I have when it was shared with me quite some time ago. But when you talk about the concept of election officials as IT managers, think about who those election officials are. And, you know, whether you're from West Virginia or other states, it may be a county clerk, it may be a municipal recorder, it could be, but, you know, you're talking about a person who has really multiple responsibilities besides elections. They've got record keeping, they've got deeds, they've got marriage, you know, they are record keepers. In our instance, it's a county clerk. So those are people who have workflow and process knowledge, right, about record keeping and elections with paper materials, right? So now all of a sudden they are being asked, as you introduce components to whether it's voter registration systems and everything that connects to it, or whether it's electronic voting systems, all of these elements are interconnected. And in our case, well, yeah, so just think about that. We may come back to this, but if you understand, all of those systems are interconnected, and you're asking people who may not necessarily be IT capable or IT managers or even have strong resources locally to support all of those systems. One of the benefits when you talk about cybersecurity or even influence, like the Secretary's presentation indicated last night, we are by and large a decentralized America, and we are a decentralized set of states because most elections are conducted at the local level. We have 55 county clerks that conduct elections, federal and state, and local elections. So in some instances, we have city recorders that conduct only municipal elections, but those are starting to hop on the statewide ballots and the local county ballots. In the state of Wisconsin, they have 1,800 municipalities. They don't have a county sort of structure, but it's 1,800 separate municipalities. So at the state level, they are really decentralized when you talk about trying to implement things or even assess things. So that's a benefit when it comes to protecting the conduct of elections, is we are largely decentralized. That's a good thing. I think somebody last night had a question for the Secretary. Do we ever imagine going to more a uniform platform? And the answer is probably no, because I think the states will always fight for any sort of, they'll fight against any sort of centralization, namely as an argument for not being able to influence it. So we also think of the elections ecosystem in three separate segments. We did really early on in 2017, we invited the media in to sort of explain this, just to give them a better idea of the ecosystem, and so that maybe they could communicate better, the more accurate information, and try to dispel some of the disinformation, which obviously we'll get to in just a few. But if you think about it, pre-election, that is by and large a connected segment. A lot of it is public facing. A lot of it is interface heavy. And a lot of it is vendor light, meaning that vendors don't do a lot in the pre-election space. More often than not, it's the state or the locality that controls that segment. Election day, not connected. It is very private. If there is any connectivity, it is in a private network environment. It is vendor heavy, and there are only a few vendors in the voting systems sphere right now. When we talked about that VVSG, the Voluntary Voting Systems Guidelines, those are actually being stripped with some of the specifics to allow more voting systems to be certified and entertained. So you're stripping, it's kind of like doing an RFQ, specifying that you want a particular brand of hardware. You're just saying, we want a piece of hardware that does this. The new VVSGs, if those are approved, those will actually open the market for more open source and more piece part systems. And that probably is a good thing for the market overall. And they are interface light, meaning that there's not a whole lot of things that connect to that very disconnected private voting system. That's on election day. That's where voting happens. Post-election goes back to more of a connected sphere. It is more public-facing. It's vendor light. Again, by and large, it's the states, the localities that control that, but it can be interface-heavy as well. So we take a look at that first segment. The pre-election segment involves campaigns, candidates. Obviously, if nobody's going to run, you can't have an election. But that starts to, if you go back to the interconnected map, that starts to provide data and information for the creation of ballots, which will live in a certain segment across, or in a certain place across all those segments. You've also got emails, websites for campaigns and candidates. When you start to think about threat surfaces, when you think about attack surfaces, that is a component. That voter registration system, we happen to be a top-down. We at the state host it. We provide access to the counties to maintain their own voter registration rolls in a top-down environment. But in that environment, you have list maintenance interfaces. You've got the DMV, because when you go to the DMV, you can opt in and have your voter registration information sent to us, and we will then distribute it to the counties, and they'll process it. Automatic voter registration has been passed into law, has not been implemented, but it is coming roughly the estimate is roughly the beginning or middle of 2021. So what the legislature has required. And basically, automatic or automated voter registration makes it an opt-out process versus an opt-in when you go to the DMV and you want to update your registration. If you don't opt out, your information will automatically be sent as an application to register or to change your registration. Department of Corrections, felons, and people on probation have, they're not allowed to be registered to vote. So we have an interface for that. Online voter registration, again, a portal where you can go in, you can apply to change or register, and it is connected, again, in a sort of a DMZ situation. You've also got voter lookup tools. Again, a public-facing environment where you can go and check your voter registration, and obviously that's in a segmented, non-sensitive section. But again, you start to see where cracks open up for threats and vulnerabilities. Printed and electronic poll books, when those voter registration rolls are created, either you freeze them and you print them so that they can go out for election day, or you download that information to an electronic poll book that is used on election day. Absentee, early in person means that you will go to a location prior to election day and cast your vote using a printed or an electronic poll book. And you have, you basically have to think about how is that information stored? What's the chain of custody? Who handles that? The location, is it connected? Is there real-time lookup? UACAVA, those are the uniform and overseas voters. Transmission methods then become, again, one area of concern. We allow electronic transmission of ballots, blank ballots through email and fax. You can return it the same way. But then that opens a privacy question, because if you return your ballot, if you're overseas or a member of the military, you can vote by sending your ballot to your local election official. They get it, but they see how you vote because they have to transfer that particular ballot into whatever their voting system mechanism is. They have to create a ballot in their actual voting system that represents the intent. So the voter, basically, if they vote from overseas or if they're in the military, they're giving up their privacy of that ballot when they send that back to their local election official. That's one thing. Now, one thing we have introduced here in the state of West Virginia for the first time, we became the first state that allowed the UACAVA voters to vote through a mobile voting app. The risk reward of that is important to our secretary because a lot of people will have very strong, the election security community is really skeptical of that method. Any online voting, but our secretary believes in the security around that application as it has been explained to us, and the risk reward is beneficial to him because if you think about traditional mailing ballots overseas, sending them back, email, faxing them, and sending them back in that same method, in his mind, a soldier stationed on a hillside in Fallujah or a sailor under the polar ice cap in a submarine does not always have access to a printer, email, fax machine, and most times they do have access to a phone. So the risk reward, and that is, we could really go down the rabbit hole on that, but we've taken a little beating from the election security community about doing that because they don't believe that any sort of online voting or mobile voting can truly be secured. But again, for him, it's a risk reward. But when you think about transmission methods, it's why it's highlighted, because I wanted to talk about that mobile voting app. And there are horror stories about a guy in Australia paying $50 to FedEx his ballot back, and it didn't make it back in time. So he lost $50, and his vote wasn't counted. Very important to the secretary and a lot of people conducting elections. Ballot tracking systems is another thing for pre-election. If you request an absentee ballot, one of the mandates of HAVA is that the state provide free access to be able to track if your ballot has been sent, if your ballot has been returned, been received, so things like that. On election day, back to that voter authentication systems. Now we basically cut the cord and we operate in a really disconnected vacuum. But part of it is those poll books, the voter rolls used to approve and authenticate a voter when they go to vote on election day. Those can either be printed out of the system or they could be contained on an electronic poll book, right? Again, think chain of custody, a possible, impact point. Voting systems, those are all of the voting machines. So everybody has been to vote? Yes? Show of hands? Yes, everybody has voted. So, whatever type of machine, imagine, it can be a direct recording where it's a touch screen. It can be an optical ballot where you fill it out and you have it read. So those capture, the voting devices and the tabulation, because regardless of the device, it's going to house votes cast, and then that has to be transported, not transmitted. Those votes cast has to be transported to a tabulation system. Again, disconnected, but part of a little private network in some way. There are ballot on demand options now. There is reporting that happens on election night, but typically that's blue collar. Whatever that tabulation system is may spit out a report, that the local election official will just put on a table so the media can ingest. Some actually go the extra mile and they will take some sort of export out of that tabulation system and display it on a screen in the center of their county, counting office or something like that, but there is a reporting that happens. But in all of those things that I described, when you talk about transporting that information, not transmitting, you have removable media, whether it's going from the vote capture device to the tabulation device, or whether it's going from the tabulation system to some sort of web display or some sort of scrolling display. You introduce concepts of air gaps, chain of custody, so now you're talking more about physical controls and physical protections, but it still is security around elections. And that's sort of, described there, that soft reporting that happens potentially starts to reconnect that disconnected segment in a way. Now we're back to a post-election, after election day, goes more to a connected segment. You have unofficial results that happen that night. So when we're talking about printing out a piece of paper and giving it to the media, or we, export it to a web display somewhere in their county clerk's office or something, that is unofficial. It's only about a week to 10 days later, after the results are canvassed, that the results become official. Okay? Typically, unofficial results are sent to the state level, and this again is a top-down system on election night, and we display unofficial results on a website that a vendor hosts for us, but it is a state-level system. Okay? So we're back to a connected, public-facing display system. Okay? But there are APIs against that system, there are exports from that system, and there are other county local, websites where that unofficial information is displayed. Once the canvass happens and the results are official, then what is displayed after that process becomes official results. The one thing I like to point out at that point is, regardless of what that piece of paper that spit out on election night, or what that scrolling web display on election night may say, or even what the official results may say on our website or a county website after the canvass, the election is not there. The election happens in that disconnected segment on this day, and it resides in that tabulation system, and it resides in the results that are then canvassed. So the election happens in a vacuum. That's where the official election happens, not on the website that is displaying the results. We hope, always, that the results that are displayed match the results that are in that disconnected system. And the counties and we both make a big effort to make sure that errors do not happen to cause confusion. So after that happens, after the results are certified, then you go back through an auditing process, and that varies across states. As to, sometimes it's a percentage. We have in law, we have a certain percentage of precincts that have to be hand counted, because back here, one thing I didn't call, every voting system has to have a voter verifiable paper trail. So when you do an audit, you use that paper copy at a percentage, and if the results of the electronic tabulation and your hand count match, then you have completed an audit. A lot of states are going to a very public risk limiting auditing process, which means they audit 100% of everything. just to make sure that the machines accurately reflect what the paper contains. Another thing that we're participating in, and a lot of states are doing or already have had, is GIS. Because delivering the appropriate ballot to the right person in the appropriate jurisdiction is really important. So GIS technology is now, obviously being used to sort of audit that process to make sure that not only during an election, afterwards you can determine that people got the right ballot, but even ahead of time. It helps with district maintenance. So at the end, after an election is complete, or even during an election night, the goal of the local election official and the state, and for that matter, the country, we want to make sure that there is a sense of being the trusted source, right? Because we're starting to move just shortly into an area where information provided is not always accurate or trustworthy. So, most government officials attempt to be as transparent as possible and show as much competency as possible, but we now are in an age of disinformation and misinformation. It's just where we are. So, I'm going to take a break, get a drink. That's a lot of information to throw at you, so I'm giving you a cat with lasers shooting out of its eyes. Just to sort of break up the monotony. This actually is, there is a story behind it. And there's actually a website out there called the Psychedelic Data Cats. So that's a group of us that, as this elections technology industry was branding itself, think of us as, I don't know, lawful neutral or maybe, pure neutral, I'm not sure. But, the elections technology, once all this data started becoming available at the state level, then more people wanted it and more systems wanted it. So two of the projects that I've been involved with over the last several years, the Voting Information Project by Google, if you go through, one thing that election officials and the technology folks realized was, where do people go to find election information? Like people on their ballot, where do I go vote? What were the results of an election? They go to search engines, right? So Google took it upon themselves with some funding from Pew, the Pew Trusts, to assemble a program where they went to the actual trusted source. Now that all this stuff was available at the state level, then they could go to that official source and get the official information and build something that was not deceptive or even out of date. So, if you go to Google and you search who's on my ballot, there's a lot of other websites that collect candidate and ballot information, and it might land in the top 3 results, but it's outdated, right? Just because of the algorithm or just because of the traffic, an outdated website might actually be sent to the first 2 or 3 results. So what Google and Pew wanted to do was create an official repository for that candidate information, for the polling location information. So on election day, when you see that little Easter egg at the bottom, where do I vote or, go vote, that actually goes to a project or to a data repository that is sourced by the states as official, right? And the common data format, NIST just certified the common data format for within the last couple of days. It is a common data format for voter and elections data. So if you do a search for voting system CDF, common data format, it's a great technical representation and a data format representation of that first big interconnected system screen at the granular data field level. It's really slick. So again, about the time I became CIO, and during around the 2016 election, Star Wars got more complicated, right? So now all of a sudden, my Star Wars is now prequels and the last chapters and spin-offs and things like that. Right? So my job as CIO, the job of our office, the job of election administrators, all got way more complicated because of what happened in 16. Right? So you can just look at some of the headlines there. voting machine supplier exposes 1.8, open thread, voter registration is easy to hack, cybersecurity may keep 59 million people, Russia's still doing it, 16-year-old hacked a voting machine at DEF CON, yada, yada, yada. So that's the news. So my first conference with our county clerks, I had a breakout on cybersecurity, and one of the clerks said, Dave, why are we talking about cybersecurity all the time? Well, because everybody else is talking about it now, and it's part of your new normal. So the significant events in 16 became the DNC email. Clinton and Romney both had their campaign emails were hacked. Arizona had credentials for their voter registration system social engineered and posted on the dark web. Illinois, and they actually, thankfully have been willing poster children for what's, possible. They actually got about 750,000 records in their voter registration system exfiltrated because of a SQL injection. So at least at that point, a 10-year-old vulnerability, made them a poster child for what is possible. So think about that. Once that became known, the Arizona and Illinois, if we kind of go back to this environment, when those stories make it to that environment, who knows how it's going to get spun? Who knows what language they're going to use when they do, the headline? So part of what was discovered at the time was, either 21 or 39 states were targeted. We're starting to get pieces of information from the federal government or from the news outlets or from whistleblowers or whatever. We're starting to hear things like 21 or 39 states were targeted. Well, can you define targeted? Was that strategic targeting? Was that opportunistic targeting? So, there's a difference. Either you go down the street and try all the doors, or you pick a particular house and figure out how to get in that one. So we didn't have that definition, right? But they were saying 21 or 39, so we're wondering, well, was that us? We don't know, because nobody's told us. And we'll get to that in a second, too. But, so, when you start to think about ransomware now in our life, or even back then, ransomware is traditionally opportunistic, right? It's not targeted, but if a county or some system becomes compromised by ransomware, is it related to this? The public doesn't know, and a lot of local election officials don't know either. AWS, one of the voting system vendors, left an unprotected, unsecured copy of voter data out on their Amazon cloud. Just lazy about how they had it stored. The DEF CON e-poll book thing, right? There's a story about somebody hacking an e-poll book at DEF CON, and this is happening in right around 16, 17. But what they don't say in the headlines or in the follow-up story is that the specific e-poll book they're talking about was sold on eBay by a state, and it hadn't been wiped before they put it on eBay, right? That's not cybersecurity. That's just bad quality control. Yet, if it makes it to DEF CON, if DEF CON buys it, and I've talked to Matt Blaze, we're as part of a working group together, but if it makes to DEF CON and somebody gets a headline that says they've hacked it and found all this voter information, well, all you got to do is figure out a password to log onto the box, and then all this stuff's there because the people that sold it on eBay didn't clean it up. VR systems is one of the biggest examples of a phishing exercise. This was actually Russia. They actually phished creds from someone low level in the VR system, and they just eventually worked themselves up with a significant amount of phishing hooks across an entire company, just like another country would do to gain knowledge for any other sector of critical infrastructure or even business. So after all this is happening and we're learning bits and pieces, eventually the Mueller report tied a lot of it together, and a lot of it tied to Russia and what was happening. One of the things, the IRA was being funded by millions of dollars a month to execute a campaign of disinformation and misinformation. That's not cybersecurity. It is, But when we look at everything that happened from a technical standpoint, there weren't but a couple of actual breaches that were known. The rest of it happened in the social media space. So the Department of Homeland Security, because of everything that happened in 16 and after, deemed elections as critical infrastructure. It means elections in the U.S. now is just like nuclear, water, electric. It is critical infrastructure, which means that as critical infrastructure, you have to set up an SCC, which is a sector coordinating council. That's the vendors in the election space. They have a coordinating council that develop guidelines on how to navigate the world of critical infrastructure. The Government Coordinating Council was established as well with local election officials, secretaries of state. That is government establishing communication protocols, standards, guidelines about how to function in the critical infrastructure space. A lot of you may know what the ISACs are at CIS. ISACs, and a specific elections infrastructure ISAC was created. And they have become a really, really strong partner and done some good things on the education and on the protection side. So when I talk missteps, so the reason I have Think HAVA there is because this is, again, the federal government making some sort of imposition on the decentralized elections ecosystem. In this way, it didn't have a whole lot of strings attached to it or mandates attached to it. It was more to say our U.S. elections ecosystem is now protected by what the federal government treats as critical infrastructure. So, but one of the missteps that made 16 and after so difficult was the people, and the reason I think 9/11 is because all the alphabet agencies had a piece of information about 9/11. Because it wasn't communicated, it wasn't able to be prevented, right? So in the same way, a lot of the alphabets had pieces of what was happening prior to the election, during the election, and after the election in 16, but they were communicating it to the wrong people. So if you guys were here yesterday for Josh, the state CISO, or now the state CTO, he might have seen something about what was happening at the State Office of Technology, but it wasn't known to communicate it to the state election officials, right? Because, again, it's a communication protocol, but if you're also talking about classified information, and it takes a really long time to declassify some things to operational level, some of the information that was known by the alphabets couldn't be communicated, even if they would have known who to tell that it was happening or could happen. So one of the things that came out of them establishing it as CI is there are several of us, each state, local, state election official like the secretary and a couple of members of his staff, we actually made a push to get at least 2 or 3 people with secret clearance in each state election official office so that some of that information could be communicated. And it's always in a SCIF, it's always in a private, setting. And establishing those communication protocols. Who are the points of contact for technical things, for election things, when the federal government has to communicate down. We established our own communication protocols top down from the state to the locals as well. Task forces were stood up, National Association of Secretaries of State, state election directors, CIS stood up their ISAC for us, the elections infrastructure. One of the more, typically when a problem comes up or when people have an issue in it's something like elections, a lot of times, and this isn't a knock against the academic community, but a lot of times the academic community will take that problem and they'll talk about it and they'll work group it and they will talk about it and they will work group it and things. And again, that's the nature of academia. But they rarely are able to or even need to produce a deliverable, right? There is good information that comes out of it, but an actual tangible deliverable a lot of times doesn't come out of that academic environment. But at Harvard, they created a Defending Digital Democracy program. And the 2 fellows, the chairs of that program are Robbie Mook and Matt Rhodes. They were the campaign chairs for Clinton and Romney in that election that got hacked. So this is a bipartisan effort. They stood up this Defending Digital Democracy program, and they used midlife master's candidates at Harvard's Belfer Center So you're talking about, 30-somethings that have 10 years in the NSA, 30-somethings that have 10 years in the CIA or in Navy intelligence or something like that. A really impressive group of midlife master's candidates created a playbook, and they created a tabletop exercise where they actually created the worst possible 6 months before an election and a worst possible election day. And they used a few of us in the states to help them build it. And then they brought all the states in and they ran everybody through this tabletop exercise, creating muscle memory, having injects, physical injects, technical injects, using, again, election administrators and technology people. So they really created a great deliverable and continue to produce deliverables like that. They involved Google, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, all those heavy players in what happened in that disinformation and misinformation campaign. So this is actually a quote from a friend of mine, Matt, when he describes all those people that are trying to interfere into elections. He calls them voting enthusiasts. But, what we discovered the goal was, harvesting those credentials, harvesting data so that they can change it. And, these are the worst possible scenarios, but the goals would be harvesting it, changing voter data or election results. On the connected side, being able to manipulate that to either, prevent turnout, to disqualify voters because they're not on the rolls, or even, some of you might be old enough to know this, but it's like a Dewey Wins newspaper. If you put out a website that has something that is not correct, what's the impact of that? The secretary has in his presentation the situation where Russia actually hacked Ukraine's election night reporting system. And on election night, they hacked in, they got a screenshot, or they changed results. They took a screenshot and they started disseminating that as what was happening in the election. The person who actually won with well over 50-some percent, I think 70-some percent, was listed as behind the anti-Russia candidate, right, who actually at the end only got 1%, right? So the anti-Russia candidate is shown leading in this hacked screenshot, leading the Russian favorite. So you piss the Russian loyalists off thinking that the anti-Russia guy is winning, right? So that creates either increased turnout on one side or plans to discredit the eventual winner, right? So Russia knew that they were going to be discovered and that the results would be corrected. And if, in fact, they counted on it. Because the next step then is when the results are corrected, then the people who thought their guy was going to win is showing as not winning, and the guy they didn't want to win is showing as winning. Now you piss the other groups off, right? Now the other people are mad. So that creates a distrust, a lack of competency, right? So that's one of the biggest impacts that could have. Again, you expose weakness. The redirect and sleight of hand comment comes from the fact that I'm not a social media expert. I'm not an influencer, and I don't really get most of my news from that source. I'm a bit more of a dinosaur, right? But what I do know is if in 16, and to some degree in 18, if foreign countries, even domestic operators, are trying to make me look over here at social media, then I'm more concerned about my infrastructure than ever, because I'm afraid they're trying to get me to look over here while they exploit something over here, right? So that's why and anything that happens, whether it's true or not, erodes confidence. And, my example of Ukraine, it's not limited to U.S. elections, obviously. So when I started trying to explain sort of what our new normal was to the local election officials and even to the people in our office, I grabbed some quotes. I'm not sure, again, it's somebody in our industry, but I want to say that it was Jay Johnson when he was Department of Homeland Security Secretary. I think he's the one that coined it, but I can't attribute it, so I just put unknown. But when a country goes after a county, it's not a fair fight. And that is really true when you talk about cybersecurity protections and IT resources. Dmitry Alperovich, the guy who founded CrowdStrike, his quote was, there are two types of businesses, those that have been compromised and those that don't know they've been compromised. That was his quote, but I changed it a little bit for the clerks because there are two types of organization. Obviously, they're not businesses, but they are election administrators. And I use the word hacked because that has become this crazy, multi-definition word that everybody uses for the same one definition, right? Especially when all this information was coming out in 16, they said hacked. Oh my God. You know, when somebody has a fake profile thrown up on Facebook, what's the first thing that everybody does? They go and say, I've been hacked. No, you haven't been hacked. No, you don't have to change your password. No, they don't see everything. But when somebody thinks that a cyber event has happened, they just say hacked. So I brought that up with them to tell them, you know, hacked has a definition for a lot of people, but it probably is not the same definition that you might have on your front porch. And then from training day, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove, right? So even if an election official knows that their process is solid, if any of those things that were displayed happens, it erodes confidence, and you are chasing that rabbit down the hole trying to prove or disprove a false positive, right? And that's almost an unwinnable, unattainable goal. So that goes to sort of how I tell them to approach it and how to start thinking in terms of a cyber posture or cyber resilience. So interaction between IT and election intensifies. Again, you know, after what happens in 16, there is a new normal, but there is also a new vocabulary. It brings IT and technology back together, but in a much more intense dialogue. So the question you ask, well, and the other thing is, you know, for decades, election officials have been trying to administer elections in the most efficient, secure, accurate, profound way. They've been doing that for decades. Technologists have been protecting and securing their networks, their technology for decades, right? But independently. So now you have to make them have that dialogue with a common vocabulary. And the thing you have to ask the people is, you know, the election officials, do you know where you are vulnerable? When you think about that interconnected, you know, map of systems, do you know where you are vulnerable in that entire interconnected ecosystem? And do you know who is responsible for protecting you against each of those vulnerabilities? Because if you think about it, the state supplies some of the technology in that connected system. Vendors provide others. Counties provide others, right? It could be a multitude of protectors against vulnerabilities in that environment. So you have to identify who is responsible, not only identify the vulnerability, but identify who's responsible for protecting you against it. The challenge sometimes is when you talk about state or county, it can be political. And when you talk about third-party vendors, it can become internalized. They're protecting their intelligence and they're protecting their proprietary information, right? It's just the nature of business. So you have to learn to navigate that, because if you expose a vulnerability and you are an elected official, you may not want to disclose that vulnerability or ask someone to check for a vulnerability because you may be looked upon as weak or unelectable, right? We in the tech community really don't have that to worry about. Most things are black and white to us. But you have to realize that when you're talking about this ecosystem, there is some red and some blue and some purple and some green and brown. And again, introducing just the concepts to things that we think about a lot to people who are not necessarily technical, you have to think about network. You know, that's one threat surface. Connectivity, the hardware, workstations, switches, routers, think work and personal. Because if you become a target in an elections ecosystem, if you compromise a personal device, it may lead you to a work device, right? So you have to explain that or just make them aware. Software, web apps, sites, operating systems. So many of the breaches, the big breaches, have been what? Known but unmitigated, right? Vulnerabilities. Cybersecurity is not convenient, but lazy can be really, can have some pretty damaging consequences. Human, I don't even know what to do. You know, a lot of times how do you explain that? You know, somebody has their creds, you know, we've been saying for years, don't put your password on a Post-it, right? Now, at least in our environment, we have some we have some credibility, or we're able to capitalize on some events unintentionally. Because this is now a larger discussion, when we talk about password complexity, when we talk about multi-factor authentication, it's not a want, it's now a need, right? And that goes for controls, it goes for mistakes. If you make a mistake, you got to own up to it, because if you try to hide it, it's going to snowball on you. And then physical security, chain of custody, removable media, those types of things. So the way we approach it, and I have a tendency to talk long, which I am doing, sorry. So when we talk about how we approach it from the state perspective and from the county perspective, this is one thing that DHS helped us create, and it is a security planning snapshot. It has initiatives that we would like to see the counties pursue. And again, what's good for the county a lot of times is good for us too. But joining that EII SAC so that you get intelligence information, sign up for a vulnerability scanning or vulnerability management program, and do remote pen tests, do cybersecurity evaluations, go to the .gov domain, DMARC. If you can explain DMARC, then then you've wasted time. Just do it. And then participate in cybersecurity awareness. So the initiatives, recognizing and this as a snapshot is just a slick sheet for them to recognize things, because you say DDoS, have you protected against DDoS? You have to explain DDoS, right? So this gives them a slick sheet to recognize some of the things, and then put contact information. Developing an incident response plan is key. Write it, post it, and test it. Imagine the worst thing. That's where the tabletop comes in. Controls, evaluate who is responsible for what you're using, what technology you're using. Do you follow CIS controls? Do you follow NIST framework? If you don't know who to ask that question of, then you don't know your environment. Again, some of the safeguards involved in that pre-election, election, and post-election segments. One of the biggest things is that we try to tell them is backups. You may not be a target, but you may have an opportunistic ransomware event. And it happened in Harrison County here. They had documents that went back to the 1800s that they'd spent 14 years scanning and digitalizing, and they lost them because of a ransomware event that started on a backup server, laid latent for a couple of weeks, learned the backup schema, and then after that backup schema cycle was done, it launched itself, and it killed it. Luckily, it didn't affect the election systems, which is our first concern. It's where those communication protocols come in. If you learn of an event, let us know. We can evaluate the impact on at least the things that we're helping you protect. So yeah, this is it really is a nice, slick project, and last mile's trademark, because that's sort of what has been has come out of that DHS program. And then the next steps, honestly, mark something off, make a commitment, set a deadline as to a time when you're going to have this done, keep that commitment, and then move to the next. This is just sort of the mantra that the Secretary has adopted and our office has adopted. Protect, detect, correct. Makes a lot of sense for you guys, I'm sure, but those are just some of the partners we've had at the top. And then at the bottom, with the question for Secure West Virginia and this group, I guess my ask becomes, if any of you can lend your expertise, so now you sort of have an understanding of the landscape and maybe where you fit in. And some of you may already be involved in elections technology. Some of you may already be poll workers. You obviously, most of you or all of you have voted. So lend your expertise if you have a company or you're a contractor or something. As you sort of learn that landscape, where might you be able to insert yourself, your business, your expertise? Because as a lot of you may know, your local jurisdiction may need help. Filling in some of the gaps of understanding or protection. Get involved. If you want to learn more about the landscape, you can certainly contact me, our office, your locals, if you're not from here. be a poll worker, pay attention, be aware of what happens in the elections process. I'm curious to know if any of you, if out of Secure West Virginia, if there is any intel sharing among you. Do you guys have information sharing? Do any of you use, sort of congruous platforms? Are you all sharing information across platforms through monitoring systems, IPSs, anything like that? And maybe it would be beneficial for you to do so. And then the other thing is amplify the correct info. Once you learn a truth about a system, once you understand, the specifics of this ecosystem, try your best to amplify the trusted information, the official information, and the correct information. And, it kind of goes without saying, don't amplify the incorrect information. You guys know better than anybody else, about, thinking before you propagate information without vetting it, that kind of thing. So those would be the asks, maybe, if you can and if you're interested in it. The secretary has a real passion for this. He's, 23-year military guy. All of his kids have served in the military, and he's passionate about voting. And it's just one of the things the office does, but he's really passionate about it because his son got injured in Afghanistan, but still said the hardest thing he ever did overseas during his service was trying to vote. So the secretary is offended by foreign or domestic operators trying to influence or damage our elections process and democracy. He takes it to heart, and it really trickles down to the rest of us. And I think, regardless of how you feel, anytime anybody tries to, mess with democracy, it's worth defending. So yeah, that's it. Any questions, I guess? I mean, my email's up there, and I know I've run maybe just a tad over, but if anybody has specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. Or yes, sir.
Has there been an idea where, kind of like a state, because I know you said it was kind of a top-down
Mm-hmm.
thing, where, you had like a committee or a group of people that went to each county and kind of did some basic pen testing or something that could help them show their weaknesses, because I'm sure like Boone County would have different weaknesses. They might need, more people, physical security than they need,
Oh yeah.
So has there been like a one group that kind of went to every county and did checks?
We've offered that up. A lot of states have approached it that way, because there was one of the things I didn't get to when I talked about the partnerships was there was a second round of federal funding as a result of what happened on the cyber side. So in our particular instance, we actually created a grant program. We kind of did a 70-30 split. We kept about 30 of it to help bolster our cyber posture. Obviously, some things that we had to spend for. But we offered a grant program to the counties so that they could take that second round of funding and do that. Work. Some of them have a really large footprint with some third-party vendors. There's a couple of vendors in the state that have a large footprint across counties, so they're the natural people. We just encourage them to do that assessment. But Ohio, on the other hand, and the state of Iowa, they actually took part of their money and they created that force that went to each of their 99. We took a little different approach and said, we did, surveyed them, tried to identify gaps, and then recommended, because the Department of Homeland Security, their CISA agency, they're actually offering a lot of those services free. And as we get closer to 2020, they're moving those people up. And if any of you know about the Einstein sensors, the Albert sensors, things like that, they're offering Alberts free to a lot of instances. And some of those, like NCATS is doing remote pen testing and things like that, they're moving election-related requests up the food chain. So we try to connect them. EIISAC has a free VMP program. And so, yeah, we're making known all of the resources available to them, and not necessarily coming in, sort of like stormtroopers to go back, and say, you need to do this, you need to do this. We're trying to educate them about the landscape. And again, where might you be vulnerable? Who can help you identify those vulnerabilities? Yep. Yes, sir.
So do you feel like there's a spectrum across the states of how well the states are doing with election security? And if so, what do you think are the factors that, or the reasons some states
I think by and large, most of them are parallel. I would say there are some who are far more advanced because of the things they were already doing. Like the state of Colorado has a great relationship with the Air Force. The city of Denver itself makes a lot of states look like amateurs when it comes to cooperation, cybersecurity, intel sharing, things like that. So I would say somebody like the state of Colorado was already doing things. And a lot of these things, I have a tendency to say sometimes we're making much ado about nothing. That's not, I can't really say that because again, there are battlefields like social media that I don't know if you can defend against something like that, right? And the technologists have been doing these things. They've just been begging. I say we're at a threshold kind of like we were maybe 25 years ago when the gray hairs, and I'm a gray hair now, so I can say that, when the gray hairs that, were CEOs of businesses wanted email and they wanted connectivity and things like that, they asked the IT guys, and the IT guys said, you're going to have to spend some money, and then it became, is it really worth it? Now I think we're at that threshold where spending on cyber has to happen, right? So in that same vein, other states were already doing things. So I would say there are more states that have already been out front. The remainder of the states, I think, are really running alongside, because of the resources, the education that CISA and DHS have done, that EII SAC. I think that education campaign has made them all stand up. Because it's CI now, because it's critical infrastructure, they kind of have to. So right off the top of my head, I can't think of any state that is really behind because they're all taking federal money, they're all taking free resources, and they are focusing on their cyber posture. So is there disparate, are some better than others? Yeah, obviously. But I don't think there's anybody really lagging back in the pack. Not that I'm aware of. So. Yes, sir. Oh, it's
That's what we do from a cybersecurity point.
It's huge.
My organization does pen test on the test, and almost every plant we go into, they've just gone through security training within 1 month. We target 100 people, we just practice almost every time.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yep.
So what are you guys looking at to help alleviate that human factor that you want to monitor their application?
Well, obviously, wherever we can find access controls that we can, plant least privileged, looking at applications, looking at systems, and trying to put the controls in place that make the human element more negligible. We're obviously doing that. But Evan Pauly works for me. Actually, he's in the crowd here. We actually hired a cybersecurity specialist to work in our office specifically because of this. That's one of the spends we had. We felt it was so important. I call him like the human SIM, though, because, we don't quite have enough money for a SIM, but we got enough money for a human SIM. But he actually crafted a really clever, he took a white hat approach to, hacking. It was a black hat hack done by a white hat, really, a phishing exercise that he created. So we're doing that. We're trying to fish our employees in those local elections as much as we can, do things like that. But education, they're getting sick of hearing from me, but I'm trying to, like I said, just identify as many free and partnered resources to help educate them. That's sort of the moving goalpost we're all chasing, is how do you educate people to the point where they know as much as maybe we do, recognizing those signs, trying to identify those flags and things. And now I can say with sort of a half-cocked smile on my face that now we've got at least our employees so worried that they kind of don't do anything without asking ahead of time. So, but using those resources that are available and trying to implement the controls ahead of allowing the human to even factor in. That's kind of what we're trying to do, and trying to encourage the counties to do. Any other questions? One other thing, and I'll let you go. I'm sorry for running over, but I do want you to consider the vetted security possibilities, the security research possibilities maybe that this group has. Vulnerability disclosure programs are something that my industry or some of my peers and I are talking about. Some of the states, at least at the Secretary of State level, is really interested in doing VDPs for our stuff and getting the vendors on board to do that as well. Because a VDP with a vendor will at least sort of discourage so much internalization about the services that they provide. So, yeah, just vetted security research, warts and all. I mean, you kind of need to know warts and all, like you said. That's if you don't learn, you don't grow. So sometimes you have to make mistakes to learn. Well, thank you guys for paying attention. I mean, I really appreciate it. I hope this was interesting. Hope it was valuable. And get involved, even if it's just voting.